Hello and welcome to Gatecrashers. Human design has gate 7 as the gate of direction, the role of the self, and the way forward. In this Gatecrashers episode, we explore the energy of gate 7 through the character of Cedric. This series brings the human design gates to life through story, through pattern, and through lived expression. Gate 7 explores knowing which way the group is already trying to go. It explores direction without command, and also the power behind the throne. If you're studying human design or exploring your own chart, this series may well help you recognize the energy of each gate in real life. Today's episode for Gate 7 is called The Incident of the Missing Turnip Cart. The village of Upper Bottomley had many traditions. Some were sensible, such as the spring fair, the harvest festival, and the annual avoidance of Mrs. Crumble's horseradish wine. Others were considerably less sensible, and one such tradition was the Great Turnip Procession, during which a heavily decorated cart overflowing with prize-winning turnips was pulled through the village while everyone applauded and pretended that this was a perfectly reasonable way to spend a Saturday afternoon. Nobody could remember why the procession existed. Whenever newcomers asked, the villagers would just shrug and reply, "Well, it's just what we've always done," which, in Upper Bottomley, was all you needed to know. This particular year, disaster struck. The cart had vanished. Not just the turnips, the entire cart, gone, disappeared sometime during the night before the procession. By breakfast, the village was in an uproar. People ran about looking purposeful without actually doing anything useful. Meetings were organized. Additional meetings were organized to discuss the first meetings. Someone proposed forming a committee. Someone else suggested 2 committees, just in case. By 9:30, there were 7 committees, 3 clipboards, a tray of scones, and absolutely no turnip cart, which was precisely when everyone turned to Cedric. Now, Cedric was a goose, a magnificent white goose with an impressive chest and bright orange feet, and the permanently irritated expression of someone who had spent most of his life pointing other people in the right direction. Cedric ruffled his feathers. "Why," he demanded, "are you all staring at me?" Mrs. Crumble blinked innocently. "Well, because you're our elected leader." "I most certainly am not," Cedric honked. "You always tell us what ought to be done," piped up Mr. Crimp. "No," huffed Cedric, "I merely point out the obvious." "Exactly," chorused the committee. "No," replied Cedric, "not exactly. Those are 2 entirely different things." Nobody seemed convinced. Cedric sighed the sigh of someone who'd been having the same conversation for at least the last 12 years. The problem, as Cedric saw it, was that Upper Bottomley had a dangerous habit of mistaking anyone with a clear view for someone in charge. This was, in his opinion, deeply unfair. He had never asked to be responsible for humans. He had not printed leaflets or filled in a form. He had not stood on a box and made promises involving stronger fences and cheaper oats or an end to unnecessary bunting. He had simply, on several occasions, noticed which way the village was already trying to go and just pointed his beak in that direction. Humans, being humans, had decided this was leadership. He'd rather herd cats. Cedric waddled into the middle of the square. Behind him, the other geese arranged themselves in a line. They did this because geese understand formation without instruction, and this alone gave them an advantage over most committees. Right, said Cedric. Who saw the cart last? Silence fell. The villagers looked at one another with the slightly panicked expression of people who had spent all morning forming subcommittees and had forgotten to gather information. Mr. Brindle raised a hand. Yes, said Cedric. I saw something last night. What did you see? A large, dark shape. Was it the cart? Oh, it may have been. And where was it? Oh, it was out near the barn. Well, the cart is usually near the barn. Yeah. So you think you saw the cart where the cart usually is? Yeah, possibly. Cedric closed his eyes and shook his head. Mrs. Crumble was next to raise her hand. I heard wheels. Excellent, said Cedric. When? About midnight. From which direction? Mrs. Crumble paused, taking on the look of a deer in the headlights. From the road, because geography wasn't her strong point. There are moments in every natural leader's life when they must decide whether to serve the collective good or bite someone. Cedric chose service, but only because Mrs. Crumble was wearing very thick stockings. A small child called Elsie tugged at his wing. Elsie was 6, smelled faintly of jam, and was one of the few humans Cedric considered tolerable. I saw tracks, she said. Cedric turned. Where? Behind the bakery. And you didn't mention this before? Elsie shrugged. Well, I did, and no one heard me because they were all shouting about governance. Cedric looked slowly at the adults. The adults looked at their shoes. One of them coughed in a way that suggested governance had suddenly lost some of its dignity. Show me, said Cedric. Elsie led the way behind the bakery, followed by Cedric, the geese, Mrs. Crumble, Mr. Brindle, 2 committee chairs, 1 deputy committee chair, a treasurer who had appointed herself treasurer without anyone noticing, and a man carrying the scones, because he felt they were now involved. Behind the bakery, pressed into the damp earth, were 2 deep wheel ruts. They curved away from the barn, past the flour bins, and disappeared towards the lane. There, said Elsie proudly. Cedric inspected them. At last, direction. The lane led out of the village and towards the hill. The committees stood quietly. The hill was not high, and still it was a hill, and not many of the committee had ever bothered investigating it, because it involved effort. Cedric watched them. This was what people misunderstood. Leadership was rarely a matter of charging heroically ahead. It was mostly standing very still while everyone else ran in circles, waiting for the actual direction to become visible. He looked at the tracks. He looked at the sky, because he was a goose, and geese are required by ancient law to look meaningfully at the sky. And then he looked at the hill. The cart went uphill, he said, to a collective groan from the villagers. The hill? But it's so steep, and there may be nettles. Cedric turned his full, irritated splendour upon them. Then we shall cancel the procession. The villagers looked horrified. Cedric honked. Exactly. Get up the hill. Now. Nobody moved. Cedric sighed, honked again, and began waddling down the lane. After 3 steps, he stopped. Well? The other geese followed immediately. Elsie followed the geese, and after Elsie came the man with the scones. Once the scones were moving, the village had no choice but to follow. This was the moment, though no one noticed it, when Cedric's role became clear. He did not drag them. He didn't command them. He did not inspire them with a stirring speech about turnip heritage and the sacred obligations of root vegetables. He simply began moving in the direction the evidence already suggested, and the village, after its customary delay, came with him. At the top of the hill, they found Mildred. Mildred was 92, possibly 93, and had lived in Upper Bottomley long enough to remember 6 vicars, 4 floods, 3 scandals, one involving a goat named Neville, and she was sitting on a stile, knitting something long and purple. "Morning," said Mildred. Cedric stared at her. "Do you know where the cart is?" "Oh, yes," she replied. "Why," he said carefully, "did you not tell anyone?" Mildred looked surprised. "Well, nobody asked." Cedric inhaled very slowly. "Where is it?" asked Elsie. Mildred pointed with one knitting needle, and there, just before the crest of the hill, tucked neatly beside a hawthorn hedge, stood the great turnip cart, fully decorated, completely intact, overflowing with turnips, slightly more majestic than usual because it had mist on it. The villagers cheered. Mrs. Crumble wept. Mr. Brindle declared it a miracle. Elsie hugged a goose by mistake and apologized, and Cedric waddled toward the cart and inspected it. Nothing appeared damaged, the ribbons fluttered bravely, the turnips sat in solemn root vegetable dignity, and a note was tied to the handle. Cedric pecked it free and gave it to Elsie, who read it aloud. "Borrowed cart for emergency relocation of prize marrow, returned almost to original position. Sorry for inconvenience. Nigel." There was a long silence. "Nigel?" said Mrs. Crumble. Everyone turned towards Nigel, who was standing behind the scone man trying to look like a hedge. Nigel was the sort of person who treated explanations as optional. He'd once painted a gate without mentioning it to anyone, thereby trapping half the village inside a field for 3 hours while they waited for the paint to dry. He was not malicious. He was simply permanently adjacent to confusion. "I meant to bring it back," Nigel said. "You left it on top of the hill," said Cedric. "I got tired." "It's a cart. It's got wheels." "Yes, but downhill seemed risky in the dark." Cedric stared at him. "You successfully took it uphill in the dark?" Nigel brightened. "Exactly. So you see the problem." The only problem anyone saw was that the cart had to be brought back down. And this led to another argument. The hill was steep, the cart was heavy, and the turnips had, if anything, gained confidence overnight. Cedric listened for as long as he could bear, which was about 27 seconds. "Enough," he said. The word was not loud, but it carried. Everyone stopped. Cedric looked at the slope, the cart, the villagers, the geese, and Nigel, who was now pretending to examine a cloud. "We go slowly. We'll manage it." It was not elegant. It was not swift. It involved shouting, slipping, 3 turnip losses, 1 bonnet incident, and a brief but memorable moment when the cart lurched sideways and Mr. Brindle made a noise rarely heard outside opera. But they shared the job, and collectively they got the cart down. They reached the village square just as the sun broke through the clouds. The bells rang from the old chapel. Someone found the bunting. Someone else found a brass band, although nobody later could explain where they'd come from. The turnips were rearranged, the ribbons were retied, and the great turnip procession began only 2 hours late, which in Upper Bottomley counted as punctual. Cedric walked beside the cart, not in front of it. The villagers insisted he had saved the day. And Cedric denied this repeatedly. He had not saved the day. He had asked questions, noticed tracks, followed direction, consulted Mildred, and prevented everyone from being flattened by vegetables. These were, in his view, basic civic functions, but the village saw it differently. Mrs. Crumble raised a cup of horseradish wine at the end of the procession and announced with considerable emotion, and only minor slurring, "To Cedric, our leader." "I am not your leader," Cedric honked. "To Cedric," they all cried. "I'm a goose." "To our goose," shouted Elsie. Cedric looked around the square at the villagers, flushed and happy and ridiculous. Mr. Brindle had turnip mud on his chin. Nigel was being supervised by 3 children and a stern duck. Mildred was sitting beside the fountain, and the other geese stood in perfect formation. For a moment, Cedric felt something shift in himself. Perhaps leadership was not ownership. Maybe it wasn't command or authority or standing on top of things looking noble, while everyone else did the carrying. Maybe leadership was simpler than that, and a lot more annoying. Perhaps it was just the willingness to stand where the direction could be seen, to listen to what the group already knew but had not yet organized, to move first, only when movement served the whole and was invited, to point, not push, to guide rather than govern. Cedric found this insight both moving and deeply inconvenient. Mildred appeared beside him with 2 cups. One contained water, the other contained Mrs. Crumble's horseradish wine. "Choose wisely," she said. Cedric sniffed both and selected the water. "Good choice," said Mildred. "You may survive the afternoon." He glanced at her. "Did you know all along they would follow me?" "Of course. But why?" "Because you don't lead for yourself, Cedric dear." Cedric looked uncomfortable. "I don't lead at all." Mildred smiled. "Exactly." The brass band played and the children danced, and Cedric stood quietly at the edge of it all. Nobody needed him at the front now. The village was moving together. He honked contentedly. Later, when the sun went down and the last turnip had been admired, roasted, judged, or accidentally sat upon, Cedric returned to the pond with the other geese. Percy asked whether this meant Cedric was officially in charge. Cedric gave him a look and said no. Percy honked. "No," repeated Cedric. "Absolutely not." The geese settled into the reeds. Across the village, lanterns glowed in cottage windows. Someone giggled, someone sang off-key and too loudly, and someone else fell into a hedge. The world continued to spin on its axis and hurl itself through space. Cedric tucked his head beneath his wing and settled into a well-deserved slumber. Humans, he decided, required an extraordinary amount of guidance for a species who insisted they knew their direction. Thank you for joining me of this exploration of Gate 7. And for Cedric, a very eccentric goose. As always, look after yourselves, love yourselves as much as you can, as much, as much as you can. And as always, go gently.